All, I wanted to take a moment to talk to you a little bit about the purpose of the discussion boards because I have begun reading some of the entries and I felt it necessary to comment on the ways in which you should approach the discussion board posts. First of all, hello, I'm Dr. Floyd. I hope that I get to meet some of you in person at some point. But for now, my thought was that I would upload videos maybe every couple days or so to talk a little bit about the material and to get you thinking about some things that perhaps did not emerge in some of your discussion board posts. So, in particular, you'll notice that the discussion boards bring with them various questions that you will need to answer. Those are a general starting point for you to think about the materials that we're focusing on in each of the separate discussion board posts that are all a part of larger modules. The way that I'd like you to approach those questions is from an analytical perspective. A lot of folks I'm noticing are more answering some of those questions either through summary, so demonstrating to me that perhaps you have read the assignment, or maybe you have skimmed material that you found online, which is what I do not want you to do. While others are taking a little bit more of an analytical approach, which I appreciated seeing. So, to just make sure that we're all clear on what I'm expecting you to do, when you're looking at these questions, I want you to be thinking deeply about the material that we've read for that particular discussion board. So, for instance, one of the first questions on the discussion board for post one asks you to think about some of the Native American creation stories that we had for this week in terms of Judeo Christian belief systems. I'm not sure everyone's clear on what Judeo Christian means, so let me clarify. What that question means is how can we compare some of those, say, Iroquois or Navajo creation stories as compared to something like the biblical creation story? If you're not familiar with the biblical creation story, you might want to look it up and maybe skim that material so that you can approach that question from an analytical perspective. And what I mean by analytical is, can you make a direct comparison between what you see represented in those creation stories from Native Americans and what you see in biblical representations of the creation story? So, what's foremost interesting to me as a professor when I read some of those pieces is that if I'm thinking about a Judeo Christian belief system, we're coming primarily from the perspective of the masculine. When in some of these Native American stories, a lot of times we not only encounter women, but also children and animals and plants. There's a lot to it that has much more grounding in things that we see all around us rather than the fantastical. The other key things that are interesting to me, and I'm just grabbing my text really quickly, are especially in terms of the Iroquois piece, where we get this whole notion of the meeting of sky and water, right? So why is it important that when sky and water meet, that is how the world was created? And how does that, say, compare to something like in the Bible where we read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth? Initially, even from that first little part, I can say that there is a sincere difference between the two, in that at least in this Iroquois or Navajo story, creation happens because of a meeting of two parts of the world and not necessarily from one particular entity. It says it happened a long time ago, they say. In the beginning, there was only darkness, with sky above and water below. Then, by some mysterious and holy means, sky and water came together. When they touched, that's when everything began. Whereas, again, comparatively to the Bible, we get in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So, my first question as a professor would be, what is that difference and why is that difference important? And we can think about that question from a couple different perspectives. So you can think about it from a primarily gender, queer theory, women's studies perspective. So that difference is clearly one between a masculine, all knowing, all encompassing creator versus something like a non named, holy and mysterious entity. And so, what does that comparison then create for the reader? We could also think about it in terms of theories of spirituality and philosophy. So, how is it that we could think about the creation of the world from the perspective of um, it just sort of happens by mysterious and beautiful means rather than being created by one particular thing? I'm also curious about this meeting of the skies and the water. There's almost this interesting marriage happening there. It's almost like a wedding metaphor, whereas for the creation story in the Bible, it's more of a function of this all powerful masculine being said the word and the world was created. So these are some of the things that I want you to begin sort of picking out. The other thing that's fascinating about this story in particular is this notion of two of twins, right? And how the worlds sort of become what they are based on these two separate entities. And so, my question then would be, how can we think through a story like this and consider why Native Americans might have told a story based on the wedding of man and woman together and the creation of two new human beings who then became parts of the world? In the story, there are also really interesting hints at infidelity. So, why might infidelity have been an important aspect of early creation stories? And why don't we see things like that in the Judeo Christian belief structure or in the biblical representations of creation? And so, as you're reading again, I want you to begin thinking about things in that multifaceted way. You don't want to think about things just at face value. So, this story says this, or this story says that. It's fine that you're able to summarize, that's great. But since this is a 200 level class, we're now sort of pushing you guys into thinking about, okay, what is the deeper meaning? And what types of theoretical frameworks or lenses can I place on these particular readings and begin thinking about them in analytical ways? That's all for now. I will likely post a video in the next couple days discussing at least the first couple selections for the semester, at least the ones that were in discussion board post one, because I think that they require some commentary about how those Native American stories are juxtaposed against early settlers' representations of the world. And I think they're an important framework through which we can think about how our thought structure and belief structure about the American way of life was shaped. All right. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me.